It's great seeing everybody this morning. We got a good crowd already, and we've got more coming in. I'm guessing that a lot of folks will be filtering in as they drop food off in the fellowship hall and making their way in. We already have a number of visitors with us. We're glad you're here today. We expect a lot more for the next hour for sure. Let's be turning our Bibles to Judges chapter 3. Judges chapter 3. We put some new papers out on the table, I guess last week, for the study of Othniel, the very first judge in the book of Judges. And we're going to be looking at him today, well, partly because we'll be looking at basically one question, and because it kind of sets the pace for the entire book, for some things we're going to be seeing in the book, and then we'll finish the discussion questions up on him next week. So sort of a two-part on the first judge with more of a look about the idolatry in that day. But we spent the first couple of weeks introducing the book of Judges. And already we see it's a very exciting book. We started in the first 2.5 chapters looking at some of the problems that kind of set up historically the need for the judges, including the death of Joshua. Remember, they considered themselves somewhat leaderless after Joshua passed, even though Caleb was still around. They considered themselves without direction. They were intermarrying with the people. They were getting involved in idolatry. They didn't drive the inhabitants of the land out. They had all these problems, and it's sort of a mix of things that ended up spiraling into the need for judges. And today we see the very first judge in chapter 3, verses 7 through 11. And then next week we'll put out some info, some discussion questions for the upcoming discussion on Ehud, beginning in verse 12. So let's look. We're going to read verses 7 through 11, and then we're going to go back, and we're basically going to focus today on the very first question, because we need to know what was happening with idolatry. Because nearly every instance of a judge involves the people being involved in idolatry. So we want to know what that was and some practical applications of that, and then we'll finish the questions up next week. Look at verse 7. So the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord. They forgot the Lord their God and served Baals and Asherahs. Therefore the anger of the Lord was hot against Israel, and he sold them into the hand of Cush-Rishathaim, king of Mesopotamia, and the children of Israel served Cush-Rishathaim, or Cushan-Rishathaim, 8 years. When the children of Israel cried out to the Lord raised up a deliverer for the children of Israel, who delivered them, Othniel, the son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother. The Spirit of the Lord came upon him, and he judged Israel. He went out to war, and the Lord delivered Cushan-Rishathaim, king of Mesopotamia, into his hand, and his hand prevailed against Cushan-Rishathaim, so the land had rest for 40 years. Then Othniel, the son of Kenaz, died. Today we want to focus on the very first question. It's a multiple-part question about idolatry. Here's the first question. Try to do some research, first of all, on Baals and Asherahs. So the goal was to, in whatever way you could look up, if you had Bible encyclopedias at home, if you had access to the internet, you could look up and do some research. What are the Baals? What are the Asherahs? So that's kind of the first part of the question. And then what do those names refer to, right? So tell us a little bit about what they represent in the land of Canaan, what was involved in the worship of these. And we'll see this as we expand outward from the book of Judges. You still see Baal, and you still see Ashtaroth. You still see references to those in the Old Testament. What was involved in the worship of those things? By turning to these, according to Judges 3 and verse 7, we'll see this secondarily. What two things happened according to Judges 3:7? So we're going to look at that verse, and he tells us there were a couple things that happened in order for them to turn to idolatry. And is there a lesson for us today? Also, is it possible to commit idolatry today? And how might some commit idolatry today? So let's just take the first part of that. when he says in verse 7, Baals and Asherahs, what in the world is that? Did you do any study? Joel and Gene. Joel, I saw your hand first, and then Gene. Joel?
I think it's interesting that Baals is plural. And
It is plural.
Singular, because all Baals were bad, but there could be slight differences between
Degrees of them, yes.
But Asheroth was the female compatriot of Baals, and she was fairly well standardized throughout, the nation wherever it was.
Yes, that's right. So the female counterpart to that. Gene, you had your hand up?
Means Lord or Master.
Yes.
So it referred to a general category of masters.
Yeah.
It was the god of storms and thunder. It's equivalent to Zeus or Thor and other mythology.
Yes. When the children of Israel went into the land of Canaan, they were warned about the religion of the people in that land. And when you survey the land of Canaan and the people that live there, sometimes we'll talk about them being pagans or they're involved in paganism. Did the people in Canaan, did they believe in one God or multiple gods? All right, so they were polytheists, right? They believed in multiple gods. And like Gene just said, in the land of Canaan, they had a mythology, right? So it becomes, and I think Gene's right, it sort of becomes the predecessor of some of the mythologies that we're more familiar with, right? You might be more familiar with Roman mythology or Greek mythology when you deal with some of the characters in Greek mythology. But they all sort of have their beginnings right here in this area. The concepts sort of translate later into other characters, but they start right here. And I think what Joel was saying is also true, that you're dealing with the male god of the Canaanites. There might have been several, there might have been degrees of that, but there is a specific Baal god in Canaan, and then there's a specific female god, and they represented the entirety of the mythology in that area. Baal was the title of the supreme god of the Canaanites. So he was the male version of their gods. And so in Babylonia, he became known by different things. You even have reference in the book of Daniel where you see evil Marduk, right? You have names that are that relate back to the Baals. But as Gene mentioned, the term means Lord or possessor. And some think earlier that this was a reference to like land or soil, that he was the god of land. But historically, he was a sun god. That's the way they worshiped him. Hey guys, come on in. Hey Eric, how you doing, brother? Good to see y'all. So historically, he was the sun god, Baal was. And they believed that he gave warmth to his worshipers. At the same time, he was a very fierce deity. He was a very fierce god. He was the fierce god of heat. And interestingly, they believed that while he was the god of the soil of the land, that it was also his sun that would burn up the crops in the summertime. So they were sort of caught in this dichotomy of a very vengeful, a very wrathful God. So that's going to come to play in just a minute with how they sought to appease a wrathful God. Okay, so there's Baal. And then in Judges 3:7, we have not only the reference to the Baals, but to Ashtaroth. And as Joel mentioned, she is the female counterpart to the Baal. She is the supreme goddess of the Canaanites. She is the female counterpart of Baal, and she was considered the goddess of love and war and fertility. Okay? So you have a lot of others that come behind that. You have a lot more that sort of follow behind those, but you have these two that represent the entirety of the Canaanite religion. Yes, Gene?
Groves and how
Yes.
messed up the groves and stuff.
That's exactly right.
It was take trees and take the trunk and carve a nude statue
Yes.
of Asheroth, in which the branches and leaves were her hair, and they worshiped the tree, and that's what the reference is.
Yeah, and you'll see that they follow in the ways of Jeroboam and the sons of the son of Nebat, and you have all these references, and it'll talk about them erecting. They'll grow back the groves, and then you've got Hezekiah or Josiah who takes the groves down. There was a constant battle of those, and you're right. They had all these imageries of Ashtaroth, very sexualized, imagery in the land of Canaan. So you have these two deities that sort of stand for the Canaanite religion. Tom?
Baalback, really, if you think of the term Baal, which is, I think, the center of the city that you were talking about here.
Yeah.
Baalback.
Yeah.
It still exists.
Interesting. That's for sure interesting. All right, so you've got these two deities, right? Baal was this wrathful, vengeful god who needed appeasing, and then you had Ashtaroth, who was a pleasure-seeking, pleasure-granting goddess. All right? So if you think about the wrathful, vengeful side and the pleasure-seeking, lustful side of these two deities, then there's two practices that sort of become the standard operating procedure beginning in the book of Judges that sort of characterize everything else in the Old Testament. And here's the first one. For a vengeful, wrathful God who is just a spiteful deity, they thought there was only one way to appease that. And that's why beginning here, you see inklings of it before, but you really start seeing it in the book of Judges. They start involving themselves in the Canaanite religion and the practice of human sacrifice. And from now to the rest of the Old Testament, right, even through up until the moment of captivity, they're involving themselves in human sacrifice. So if you can hold your place in Judges 3, let's see how this sort of snowballs into something greater. Look at 2 Kings chapter 16. 2 Kings chapter 16. Second Kings chapter 16. All right, drop down and look at verse 3. Or you've got a reference to verse 2, Ahaz, right? Ahaz was 20 years old when he became king. He reigned 16 years in Jerusalem. He did not do what was right in the sight of the Lord as his father David had done. So we get a sense that he's not going to do the right thing. And this gets into the groves and the things that Gene was talking about. Verse 3, but he walked in the ways of the kings of Israel. Indeed, he made his son pass through the fire, according to the abominations of the nations whom the Lord had cast out from before the children of Israel. When it says he made him pass through fire, does that just mean there was a fiery trial and he made his son stronger by putting him through the fire of trials? Is that what he's talking about? He sacrificed him, right? And so without going too much into it, you later have references in the New Testament where Jesus will add an eternal sense to Gehenna, right? You had this valley that ran outside of Jerusalem, and it was sort of a trash heap, and they had fires burning there. But in the olden days, they just burned their sons and daughters in it. They sacrificed their children and threw them into this fiery pit. So here's a reference to that. Say in the same book, chapter 21, 2 Kings chapter 21, here's another reference. Chapter 21, look at verse 6. Also, he made his son pass through the fire. That becomes sort of standard language for sacrifice. Practiced soothsaying and witchcraft and consulted spirits and mediums. He did much evil in the sight of the Lord to provoke him to anger. And all of this was associated with the worship of Baal and others that came along who had just names that were derivatives of the original, but human sacrifice. And it often involved not just the sacrifice of adult male and females, but it often involved the sacrifice of their children, like young children. And you get a sense of that in Jeremiah chapter 32. In fact, look at Jeremiah 32. If you go up to Jeremiah 32, that practice of sacrificing their children, God says, was one of the reasons for the captivity. Jeremiah chapter 32. And drop down with me to verse 35. He says, they built high places of Baal, so we see the reference to Baal again, which are in the valley of the son of Hinnom, to cause their sons and their daughters to pass through the fire of Molech, which I did not command them. Nor did it come to my mind that they should do this abomination to cause Judah to sin. Now therefore, thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, concerning the city of which you say it shall be delivered into the hand of the king of Babylon by the sword, by the famine, and by the pestilence. So clearly, that was one of the reasons for the captivity. And I think it's interesting, just thinking out loud in verse 35, when he says they were committing this idolatry, and he says, which I did not command them. If you want to know how bad the actions of Nadab and Abihu were in Leviticus chapter 10, it says they offered strange fire which the Lord did not command. It's as equal to this as anything. So child sacrifice. In fact, if you want to see the lasting effects of it, and sometimes we give Solomon a pass on how bad he had gotten in 1 Kings chapter 11 when it talks about him marrying strange wives. Look at 1 Kings chapter 11. And sometimes we stop reading a little too early when it describes, how they turned his heart away to other gods. But here he is, verse 2. Here's Solomon. God said, you don't intermarry with those people. Surely they'll turn your heart away from after other gods. And Solomon clung to these in love, verse 2. He had 700 wives, princes, and 300 concubines, and his wives turned away his heart. For so it was, verse 4, when Solomon was old, that his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not loyal to the Lord his God, as it was the heart of his father David. And look in verse 5. He went after who? Ashtaroth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. Solomon did evil in the sight of the Lord, did not follow the Lord fully, as did his father David. He built the high places in verse 7. He's involved in the sacrifice. Look at verse 8. He did likewise to all his foreign wives who burned incense and sacrificed to their God. What might those sacrifices have involved? Human sacrifices. I mean, that's likely what they're involved in here, and all the way down through verse 11. So if you want to understand the depths to which he went in following after these women, he involved himself fully in Canaanite religion. So the first thing that attended the children of Israel was human sacrifice because of their involvement in the Baals and the Ashtaroth. And all of that was because, remember last week, all of that was because they did not fully drive the inhabitants out of the land. And God warned them, if you don't drive them out fully, this will be the result of that. And they were warned back in the book of Leviticus chapter 8, chapter 18, and chapter 20, specifically about that very thing, about Canaanite idolatry and the sacrifices that were typical of that. Here's the other thing. So one of the things they did to appease Baal was the human sacrifice, but to appease the lustful, pleasure-granting goddess of Ashtaroth, they involved themselves in fornication and prostitution. And so you have human sacrifice and fornication that become sort of the mainstays, descriptions of the children of Israel because of their involvement in that. And they should have known from very early on that this would be a problem. Go back to Numbers 25. Do you remember what happens right after the story of Balaam? Go back to Numbers 25. Numbers chapter 25. So remember, Balak propositions Balaam, and you have several chapters of that story beginning in chapter 22, 23, 24. You have these chapters that describe that, and at the end of that you think, okay, Balaam was really tempted, but he held on. He really didn't curse the people of God. And then you read later, you read it in the book of Jude, you read it in 2 Peter, there's a reference even in Revelation where he loved the wages of sin, and he bought into the proposition of Balak, and you think, well, where did he do that? And there's a reference later in the book of Numbers where sort of on the way out the door, he just sort of gives up that they have a weakness, a propensity for idolatry, and he sort of gives that up to Balak, and he says, hey, if you really want to get the people, they're really prone to idolatry. And so following that story, immediately it says, chapter 25, verse 1, now Israel remained in Acacia Grove. The people began to commit harlotry with the women of Moab. They invited the people to sacrifice to their gods, and the people ate and bowed down to their gods. And then you have the story with Phinehas and the story that follows after that. But they obviously had a propensity for this, a weakness for that. But that becomes the other thing. And you see that throughout the rest of the Old Testament, human sacrifice. In 2 Chronicles 21, Ezekiel 16, they just gave themselves to fornication and prostitution. So their failure to stop the Canaanite religion here in the book of Judges, right early in Judges, even with the very first judge in chapter 3, verse 7, led the people down a road of further corruption. And essentially, they, like Gene said, they just started not just involving themselves, they started building pagan temples and the groves. You can read about that. Here's some references to that. 1 Kings chapter 16, Jeremiah chapter 11, and even 1 Kings chapter 18, where you actually have dedicated prophets, like Ahab and Jezebel had 450 dedicated prophets of Baal that served under that time. So go back to Judges 3 now. Let's go back to our text. Let's go back to Judges 3. And then we're going to make some practical applications following this. Judges chapter 3. All right, so they're involving themselves in this. It took two things for this to happen. Go back to chapter 3, look at verse 7. So the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord. They forgot the Lord their God and served Baals and Asherahs. It mentions they did evil, all right, but there's sort of a two-step process to get there. What's the first thing they did? What's the first thing that happened? Verse 7. What does that mean that they forgot the Lord? Yeah, you remember last week we saw that statement in Judges chapter 2, verse 10, where it says, there was a generation that came up that didn't even know the Lord. All right. Do you think that in some way they knew about him? Do you think that when the name Jehovah was mentioned that they just simply didn't know the name of Jehovah? So there's something different here other than just complete absent-mindedness of God. The word literally means to ignore. So read that into the text. The children of Israel, they ignored the Lord their God. Make a difference in how you understand that? To ignore the Lord your God. To literally be oblivious to. Was that deliberate on their part? This is a deliberate forgetting of God. So it doesn't carry the same sense of I forgot where I put my car keys. The idea is they just chose not to understand and know the Lord. This was deliberate. They no longer wanted God as their guide. And I think there is at least some application we can make from that in the form of a question, which is to say, it's easy to look at them and point a finger and say, well, that's terrible that they deliberately chose to ignore the Lord. Could we possibly fall into the same trap? Do you think sometimes people do ignore the Lord today? Yeah, so we do. It's possible to ignore the Lord. All right, so that's the first thing they did. And then number two, because they did the first, what did they do secondarily? They served the pagan deities. We as human beings are built with a desire to worship. We're built with that, okay? And when we don't do that, if we choose to ignore the Lord, then that desire to worship gets placed somewhere else. It always does, because we're going to worship something. We're going to prioritize something in our life because we're built that way. Hold your place with me and go to Acts chapter 17. And then we're going to talk about us for a little bit, because we wanted to, since so much of the book of the Judges is built around the idolatry, we wanted to spend the time this morning looking at that. Look at Acts chapter 17. Acts chapter 17. All right, so let's start in verse 16. So imagine you're Paul and you're standing in Greece and you're in a very similar situation to what you would be in the book of Judges. You're among a group of people who are very polytheistic. They believe in a lot of gods. And so here's Paul, verse 16. He waited for them at Athens. His spirit was provoked within him when he saw that the city was given over to idols. Okay, so same kind of problem in Judges. Therefore he reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and with the Gentile worshippers, and in the marketplace daily with those who happened to be there. Then certain Epicurean and Stoic philosophers encountered him, and some said, "What does this babbler want to say?" Others said, "He seems to be a proclaimer of foreign gods because he preached to them Jesus and the resurrection." And they took him and brought him to the Areopagus, saying, "May we know what this new doctrine is of which you speak? For you're bringing some strange thing to our ears. Therefore we want to know what these things mean." For all the Athenians and the foreigners who were sent there or spent their time in nothing else but to tell and to hear of something new. So in verse 22, Paul stood in the midst of the Areopagus and said, "Men of Athens, I perceive that in all things you are very religious." Now that's the point we wanted to make. He says, verse 23, "I was just passing through and considered the objects of your worship. I found this altar with this inscription, to the unknown God." Were these religious people? Were they misguided religious people? Right. There's a point in that. Even if a person doesn't understand God, like here in Judges, they literally deliberately chose not to recognize God. When a person chooses not to recognize God, if they ignore Him deliberately, which they did, there's still a part of that person, just like there is in you and me, that's going to put that affection somewhere. And it's going to be placed in something. We're going to worship something. You can not call it worship if you want to, but it's what it is because you're elevating it, you're putting it up on a pedestal, your marching orders come from that, your life revolves around that, and it's just natural. If we cut God off, our affection gets turned to something else. And here's a great example of it here in the book of Acts, chapter 17, beginning in verse 22. They were extremely religious people, but they weren't religious in the correct sense, but they had just taken that built-in desire to worship and adore something and put it where it didn't need to go. And it's the same thing that happens in Judges when they ignored the Lord and then they turned and served the Baals and the Ashtaroth. It was only natural that that occurs because they're fulfilling that part of themselves. So those two things happened. Now let's make it really personal. From a 2022 perspective, it's very easy to read the Bible and think, man, I'm glad we're done with that, right? Or to think, I understand like in maybe in an Eastern country, they still have a lot of polytheism in Eastern countries, but we don't really suffer from that in America. America is not really an idolatrous nation. True or false? False. Is it possible to commit idolatry today? But I don't know that many people have little wooden or carved stone statues in their house. How's it possible to commit idolatry? Gene?
Money, for example.
Sure.
God and mammon.
Absolutely.
If we look at drugs and human trafficking.
Yeah.
And abortion.
Sure.
All of those are no different than the people you just read about.
That's exactly right. So idolatry is not just a carved image. It's something deeper than that. It's something greater than that. Dad, you had your... Okay, anything you put before God. Look at Colossians chapter 3. This kind of goes to what Gene was talking about in practical example. And then what Dad was saying, I think, is sort of the baseline answer for that, which is idolatry is anything that we elevate above God. So look at Colossians chapter 3. Colossians chapter 3. Let's start in verse 1. If then you were raised with Christ, seek those things which are above, where Christ is sitting at the right hand of God. Okay? Well, he's talking to Christians, obviously, because they've been raised with Christ. And what's he telling them about their mind, their heart? Now that you're a Christian, where should your heart be? You put God first. You make sure that your heart is in heaven where the Lord is, right? Set your mind, verse 2, on things above, not on things of the earth. So that's what your heart should be. Verse 3, for you died. In what sense did they die? To sin. All right, so they put the old man of sin to death, and your life is now hidden with Christ in God, meaning that everything you do in life is now filtered through your relationship with the Son of God. So watch verse 4. When Christ, who is our life, appears, then you will also appear with him in glory. Therefore, put to death your members which are on the earth, right? Fornication, uncleanness, passion, evil desire, and watch how he describes this last one, and covetousness, comma, which is idolatry. Well, how is covetousness an idolatry? But it's just like Gene said, and like Dad said, because you take and you elevate something in priority over God. Because according to verses 1 and 2, who's supposed to reign in our life? All right, God is supposed to reign in our life. And if we put something on the throne where God is, that becomes the object of our devotion and our worship. Idolatry is simply the act of giving preference or attention to anything over God. And Gene even mentioned Matthew 6, verse 24, no man can serve two masters, because you create this controversy between them. You either hold to one and you despise the other, you love one and you hate the other. You cannot serve God and mammon, so you cannot do that. So in America, we may not have Now, there may be some, right? You might have isolated instances of individuals who maybe come from other countries who bring with them sort of a polytheistic view of God, and they bring an image with them. I don't know that images are necessarily our thing. You don't have, graven statues sitting at home. Some may. I'm admitting the possibility for that. But still we have idols. Right here in America, we have them. Yes, sir. Mm. Right?
Go in here. And when he went in, he lit candles in front of that picture. And I was shocked.
Right.
Because that's pure idolatry.
Yeah. Did Bear Bryant talk back to him? I don't know. But I think we can do it. I think any of us can do it, right? It doesn't have to be necessarily an image. It can be anything that we elevate above God. It can be anything that we dedicate ourselves to. Now, Gene mentioned money. Money is a big one. Could other things become idols for us? Yes, Eric?
David, it's interesting that the Old Testament, the Jews' history is defined by idolatry.
Sure.
When you consider the Ten Commandments, I don't know if you ever considered this, but God begins the Ten Commandments with idolatry.
He does.
And
He ends it with it. Sure does.
I have no other gods before me. Last one is thou shalt not covet.
That's right.
Which is idolatry. Paul makes mention of idolatry for the Jews because after Babylon, the Jews really didn't participate in idolatry anymore. But Paul will say in Philippians 3:19, that their God is their belly. In Romans 16:18, he would almost say
That's
the
right.
same thing. And so while in America we may not bow down to little Buddhas or
That's it.
or little Krishnas, but we have what I like to call the donkey and the elephant.
Yeah.
We
I put that in my notes. I was going to bring that up because I think politics becomes an idolatry for a lot of people, right? Is it okay to be, as a Christian, should we take our worldview of Christianity and apply that to politics? Yeah. Is it possible to elevate that to where it becomes the supreme thought in our life and we dedicate ourselves to that more than we do the Lord? That becomes an idol. So I think that's exactly right. And I think we have to be really, really careful about that. So money, Gene mentioned money. Our careers could become an idol for any of us. Anything else? What could become an idol? Brenda?
I think people kind of give Catholic religion a pass.
Yeah.
But it is nothing but idolatry.
Yeah.
They worship Mary.
You got a man, yeah, you
They
elevate a
worship
man.
the image of
Yeah.
Jesus. I know it's Jesus,
Yeah.
or supposed to be, but
Yeah.
still.
But you kind of reduce him to an image, essentially.
So
Yeah.
really, Catholicism is nothing but idolatry.
Yeah, it really is built on it. Anything else? What could become an idol for us, or what do you think in America is an idol for a lot of folks? What is it?
Cars.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, just stuff. Anything could become that way. What about looks and appearance? Is that for some an idol? They just dedicate themselves to that. It is. Even hobbies that in and of themselves are not wrong could become an idol if it becomes the thing to which we are dedicated. It becomes the priority of our life, which is, it's sort of eye-opening, right? It shocks us when we realize that the definition of idolatry is not simply a carved image put on a shelf somewhere, soft lit in lights and candles, but just it's simply the thing to which we give ourselves to that becomes the priority over God, and that is an idol. So it could literally be anything. But I think, we give ourselves a pass and we think, we're free of that here in America, but we're an idolatrous nation. We worship a lot of things besides God. Sarah?
A lot of it, we don't call it idolatry, but it's seeking what I want.
It is. I mean, that's essentially the definition of it, yeah. Yeah, that's what it is. All right, so let's put a peg in it here. Next week, go ahead and look at the final questions on Othniel. We'll actually get into Othniel. How much of an influence do you think that Caleb was on his younger brother? And then we're going to find out a couple of things that he does in this, and then we'll get some new notes for Ehud, and hopefully we'll do just a one-stop shop with Ehud, and we'll finish out his story, even though he's got quite a few more verses dedicated to his exploits, how he snuck in and killed the king, and we'll look at that. Thank you so much for your input today. Really, really appreciate it, and you always help me grow, and I appreciate that a great deal. Thank you.